Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming to Southwestern Oregon Community College's presentation on Juneteenth, honoring the Black freedom struggle. So I'd like to welcome all of our audience members here in person, as well as joining us on live stream today on YouTube. So we have our very special guest today, Taylor Stewart. Taylor Stewart is the founder of the Oregon Remembrance Project, a project he started in 2018 to memorialize Alonzo Tucker, Oregon's most widely documented African-American victim of lynching, which occurred in Coos Bay in 1902. For the past 4 years, in addition to doing a TED Talk, check it out, it's really good, and being part of an upcoming OPB documentary, Taylor Stewart has been at the forefront of Juneteenth celebrations across the state of Oregon, lending his expertise and passion to the cause. Taylor's first time working on a Juneteenth celebration was actually in 2021 in Coos Bay. So today we welcome him back. So without further ado, Taylor Stewart. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It is my honor to be here in Coos Bay celebrating Juneteenth with you all. As mentioned, my name is Taylor Stewart, and I'm the Executive Director of the Oregon Remembrance Project. I help communities with truth and reconciliation projects around repairing historical injustice. And that work began here in Coos Bay surrounding the story of Alonzo Tucker, and now extends to cover other stories of historical injustice in Oregon. Juneteenth in Coos Bay holds a special place in my heart, but more importantly, I believe it also holds a special place in the future of Oregon. That may sound grandiose, but I don't believe it's an overstatement. There was a spirit of emancipatory justice incepted at Coos Bay's first Juneteenth celebration in 2021 that I believe has the power to shape Juneteenth celebrations across Oregon, which is why I'm here to encourage you all to keep that spirit going so that the rest of Oregon may look to you as an example. Like many of you, Juneteenth wasn't a part of my yearly calendar till later in life. I don't remember when I first learned about the holiday, but I do remember the first Juneteenth event that I ever attended. However, it wouldn't be until years later that I realized the irony of where I celebrated that first Juneteenth event, and that realization was one of two seminal moments for me that really crystallized my understanding of the holiday. In 2019, I had been invited to a Juneteenth event at McLaren Youth Correctional Facility in Hubbard, Oregon, after doing a series of volunteer activities there. The event consisted of your typical Juneteenth components with food, music, story, and history. However, it wasn't until a few years later that I realized the irony of celebrating freedom surrounded by young Black boys who are disproportionately represented in a form of modern enslavement. This dichotomous experience of celebrating freedom in the midst of a modern slavery crystallized for me the importance that Juneteenth should not be solely focused on the past, but should also be focused on our present struggles today. Because in many ways, we are still shackled by the stories of the past, unable to move forward until we are emancipated from the lingering chains of historical injustice. The second seminal experience for me regarding Juneteenth came thanks to Coos Bay's first ever celebration in 2021 when we unveiled the Alonzo Tucker historical marker outside of the Coos History Museum. When this combination event was originally proposed, admittedly, I was hesitant to want to do both at the same time. I was worried that celebrating the Alonzo Tucker historical marker and Juneteenth would dilute the significance of each of them. I was afraid that we would lose the meaning behind why we were gathered, either to memorialize Alonzo Tucker or to celebrate the emancipation of African Americans. However, thanks to the group's wisdom, I began to see the unveiling of the Alonzo Tucker historical marker as not a dilution from the meaning of Juneteenth, but actually as a manifestation of the holiday's original creed of emancipation. I tell people that there are two dates of significance on the Alonzo Tucker historical marker: 1902, when the lynching occurred, and 2021, when the historical marker was unveiled, and that we can't fully understand the story of Alonzo Tucker only focusing on the 1902 date, as the story now continues on into 2020 and 2021, when that same community where his lynching occurred used his memory as inspiration for becoming a community more committed to the ideals of truth, justice, and reconciliation. I believe that through that first Juneteenth celebration, we broke the chains of injustice that had long shackled our memory of this tragedy. And Coos Bay became free to move forward this story to an ending of justice. This first Juneteenth celebration in Coos Bay became significant, not only for the community's history, but also for the history of Oregon. Because this is a story of emancipatory justice, a story that has become a source of inspiration to communities across the state. The following year, in 2022, I brought this story to the community of Oregon City. Reflecting on the significance of historical reconciliation acts, I encouraged the people of Oregon City to similarly memorialize a man in their community history, a man named Jacob Vanderpool. Jacob Vanderpool is the only known person actually expelled from Oregon under the state's Black exclusionary laws. He was a business owner and was forced to leave Oregon after a competing white business owner conspired to have him arrested. Shortly after, Jacob Vanderpool was expelled from the state of Oregon, never to return. Similarly, to Coos Bay, the folks in Oregon City are working to place a historical marker where Jacob Vanderpool's business once stood. This last weekend, I was on a panel in Oregon City as part of their Juneteenth celebration. This panel was the culmination of the community's conversation series around a recently published book by a local author called The Place We Make. This book is about Jacob Vanderpool's expulsion and is written by Sarah Sanderson, a distant relative of the man who conspired to have him arrested. As part of Sarah's grappling with her community's story and this story of Jacob Vanderpool, she references Coos Bay at the end of her book as an example for how her community could pursue historical reconciliation. Much of the conversation surrounding the book has had to do with the question of what could have been had Jacob Vanderpool not been expelled from Oregon. Had he been allowed to stay, would there be a street named after him in Oregon City? Would his business be a historical landmark? How could his presence in early Oregon City have differently shaped the experience of African Americans in that community today? In many ways, Oregon City has been shackled by this question of what could have been. In our pursuit of freedom from this question, we made the first public proposal to create an African American specific community center in Oregon City called the Vanderpool House. Our envisioning of a cultural magnet and cultural anchor in the community that could function as a fixture for African Americans in Oregon City and the surrounding Clackamas County area. Oregon City is not the first, nor will they be the last community to try and replicate a Coos Bay-style Juneteenth celebration focused on historical emancipation. For the last few years, I have also been working to grow this spirit in the community of Grants Pass as well. I have been working with members of the Grants Pass community for the last few years to reconcile their history of being a sundown town. Sundown towns were communities that purposefully excluded African Americans and other racial minorities from living in or simply passing through the community through a culture of fear, violence, and intimidation. Like dozens, if not hundreds of communities across the United States, there was a sign in Grants Pass into the late 1960s, early 1970s that said, "Nigger, don't let the sun come down on you here." And so the title of our work is called The Sunrise Project, with the idea that sunrise is the opposite to sundown and signals the start of a new day. Thus, we are trying to develop a new identity in Grants Pass, is that of a sunrise community, the opposite to a sundown town, a place where everyone can feel safe, respected, and like they can call that space their home. Our main organizer in Grants Pass was actually able to attend the Alonzo Tucker historical marker unveiling in 2021 here in Coos Bay. Afterwards, she and I dreamed of a similar gathering in Grants Pass, a collective proclamation for historical reconciliation regarding the community's history of being a sundown town. So in addition to our community and educational work, we are working towards the installation of a historical marker in town, covering Oregon and Grants Pass's history of racial exclusion, but also functioning as the community's stated commitment to inclusivity or sunrise commitment. Notably, this would become the United States' first ever historical marker about sundown towns. And in the pursuit of this more welcoming community, we are working to grow holiday celebrations such as MLK Day and Juneteenth. Last year was Grants Pass's first ever Juneteenth celebration, and tomorrow I'm headed over there for their second annual event. Our emancipatory Juneteenth spirit in Grants Pass is focused on the community's lingering reputation of hostility towards African Americans. One step in this journey to free the community of this reputation is by supporting local African Americans and establishing a tradition in their community that solidifies their sense of belonging in that space. Ashland, Sandy, LeGrand, and Pendleton have also started the Sunrise Project, and I hope to start a similar Juneteenth in those communities next year as well. In doing this work, I often refer to Coos Bay as an example for how this holiday can grow in a community. Juneteenth in Coos Bay was started by the Coos History Museum, who, after the first 2 years, passed on the leadership to the local African American community, who in these last 2 years have been able to put their stamp on Juneteenth in the community. Last year, there were 3 separate events, all a part of Juneteenth in Coos Bay, and based on last year's attendance of unique participants across all 3 events, I've been saying for the last year that Coos Bay has the largest Juneteenth event per capita in the state of Oregon. And I love telling people that, so this is me encouraging you all to come out tomorrow so that we can keep that title going. Which is why I'm excited to be kicking off this year's celebration with not only the 3 events here, but as also the events in Bandon and Brookings over these next few days. This is why I believe Juneteenth in Coos Bay holds not only a special place in my heart, but also in the future of Oregon. You play a central role in developing the celebration of Juneteenth statewide. As more and more communities hold their first ever events, they will be looking to you as an example for how this celebration can grow, but also as a source of inspiration for what an emancipatory spirit of justice can accomplish. Every year, more Oregonians are learning about Alonzo Tucker and historical reconciliation acts that occurred here in Coos Bay. As the Oregon Remembrance Project grows, every community that I work with learns how this work was started here. In 2022, I gave a TED Talk in Portland called How Do You Reconcile Lynching, and brought this story to its largest audience yet. Just this last week, I was on a bus tour put on by the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, and as part of their 4-hour tour of Oregon history, they mention Alonzo Tucker and his historical marker. The Oregon Department of Education is unveiling new social studies standards in 2026 and in reference educators to Alonzo Tucker's story at multiple grade levels. Just this last month, I was at the Coos History Museum filming for an OPB documentary about the Oregon Remembrance Project, and the acts of historical reconciliation that occurred here in Coos Bay play a large part in that story. I used to say it somewhat jokingly, but I've decided I am completely serious when I say I want Coos Bay to become the Montgomery of Oregon. The Montgomery bus boycotts in Alabama kicked off the civil rights era, and in the decades since, millions of people from all across the world have gathered in Montgomery to learn about the birthplace of the civil rights movement. I myself wouldn't be doing this racial justice work had it not been for my own experience in Montgomery in 2018, a trip that left me inspired. I don't want Oregonians to have to travel all the way across the country just to have that same experience, an opportunity to be inspired by a community's history of overcoming injustice. I want Oregonians to come to Coos Bay for years to come to not only learn about Alonzo Tucker, but to learn how Coos Bay was the birthplace of a movement for historical reconciliation in Oregon. Just like Montgomery, you have the power to shape agents of change for generations to come. With great power comes great responsibility, and you have a responsibility to ensure that future Oregonians who come to your community leave inspired. So I want to encourage you to keep going, keep making change, keep pursuing truth, justice, and reconciliation, because you're doing this not just for Coos Bay's spirit, but for the soul of Oregon. Admittedly, that's a lot of pressure. So don't worry, I'm not gonna leave you with this charge, wave goodbye, and say good luck. Which is why I want to leave you with two concrete opportunities you have to grow this spirit in the near future. First, keep growing Juneteenth. Tomorrow, you've got an evening of African drumming, story, history, and food at Black Market Gourmet, followed by a free showing of Black Panther at the Egyptian Theater on Friday. Your mere participation in these events feeds the spirit of justice. I was at a few Juneteenth celebrations this last weekend, and based on those experiences, I want you to know that you have something special here that has not yet been replicated elsewhere. I believe that as time goes by and you keep growing Juneteenth, more communities will look to you as an example for their celebrations. Second, come out to an event we're holding next month. Spurred on by your local Episcopal church, we are holding a memorial service for an African-American man named Timothy Pettis. Timothy Pettis mysteriously disappeared on July 6, 1924, before being found a few days later in a body of water with no visible marks of violence except for the fact that he had been castrated. The case of his murder was never solved, and this July 6th marks 100 years since his disappearance. So we have two events planned for that day. First, we have a walking tour in the morning to visit locations of historical significance to the story. And in the afternoon, we have a memorial service planned at Sunset Memorial Park. We will be honoring the memory of Timothy Pettis and adding a new chapter to his story by gathering together on the centennial mark of his disappearance. We will also be planting a type of flower that has Timothy in its name to symbolize the creation of new life that historical reconciliation affords both to those who have been harmed as well as the communities where that harm occurred. I've actually got flyers for that event. I hope you will take a few, and I hope to see many of you there on the 6th. This is what I hope Juneteenth can become: a hub for emancipatory social justice action. We're at a unique time in Juneteenth's history. While the first Juneteenth celebration occurred in 1866, it's only been a federally recognized holiday since 2021, which means that for most Americans, this is the start of a new tradition. Over these next few years, how we celebrate Juneteenth will play an outsized role in how communities celebrate Juneteenth for decades to come. Personally, I find that exciting. A lot of us weren't around when MLK Day became a federal holiday in 1986. So for many of us, this is our first opportunity to shape how an American holiday is celebrated, and I want you all to play a leading role in the celebration of Juneteenth in Oregon. So I'm here to encourage you all to keep going, keep growing this celebration, and one day, Oregonians far and wide will know where the largest Juneteenth event per capita in the state is celebrated. right here in Coos Bay with you and me. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor. That was wonderful. Now we're going to have a little bit of time for discussion with Taylor here. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand and let us know. And our lovely host, Juliana, will get the mic to you. And in the meantime, I have a couple quick questions, if that's okay. So again, wonderful speech. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing in Oregon, especially the shout outs to Coos Bay. Those are always appreciated. But have you ever faced, to be honest, resistance or possibly even hostility in your work around Oregon at all?
Yeah, I have been doing, so I'll share an example that I've been saying quite frequently over the last few years. But I've been recently thinking about sort of an addition to why that's important. It's that in any context with which you are forced to reckon with some component of your identity, that is often traumatic. We understand that a lot in terms of our own personal experiences of reckoning with who we are. And I think that can also be, it's also shared in terms of community identity. And so before I was doing the Oregon Remembrance Project full time, when I was in my master's program, I interned in an organization called Lines for Life. They're a suicide and substance abuse prevention organization. And even though I was in the Department of Communication, I still went through the training for those who were on the phone lines. And one thing from those trainings that I applied to the work that I do now is when you're on the phone with someone, this is the National Suicide Hotline, when you're on the phone with someone, you are helping them unpack their luggage, their emotions, their feelings. But what you can't do is in the call with their stuff all strewn about. You have to help them repack their feelings, their emotions, their luggage before you can end the call. And I take that same approach to community organizing, where if we're going to unpack the community history, what we can't do is then make people feel like their stuff is all laying out, because that's where a lot of the feelings of resistance, guilt, shame happen. And so people don't want that feeling of their stuff laying out everywhere. So I think it's important for me and others to help that community repack that history into something new. So in the case of sundown towns, we unpack this history of racial exclusivity, but then we also help the community repack it into this vision of a sunrise community. I play a game when I go to Grants Pass called, "Can I get this random stranger to support the Sunrise Project?" Because we have these like big bright yellow t-shirts. People be like, "So what's the t-shirt?" Well, let me tell you. And people go through this process facially. When I say the word sundown, their face goes sad. But when 2 seconds later I say the word sunrise, her face goes happy. Because they're like, "Oh, you gave me that thing, but then you gave me somewhere to put it." And so that's a long-winded way to answer the question of my best way to deal with resistance is to try and prevent it in the first place. And so I think it was maybe this weekend, I was thinking about why that sort of unpacking and repacking was successful, why modeling that has been successful, and I realized that that's because that is an approach to deal with trauma. And there's trauma when you have to rethink about your identity, your community's identity. And so that has caused me to want to reflect and study more about other approaches to trauma, because that feeling is what causes those reactions of negativity. And so the better that I can understand how to help people process these things, I think lends itself to lesser resistance on the whole.
So have patience while they're unpacking, and then but also very kindly help them repack.
Yeah. I have played my little game in Grants Pass and all kinds of places. And, even folks who you may not think of as your typical racial justice participants have been like, cool, I like this thing that you're doing. Because it's that they're not stuck in that holding place. But being able to create something that they can, in terms of doing any kind of community organizing, it's more helpful to have folks to be able to be for something as opposed to just being against something. And so being able to create something for them to be for, to do currently in their community, has really helped lessen the potential for resistance.
Thank you. So you mentioned a couple things in your speech, just showing up and participating in person, but what are some other things that non-Black individuals can do to help participate in and support the Black freedom struggle? Is that something in a community like Coos Bay is, we're pretty white, but there's a lot of folks that want to get involved in stuff, but we also want to hold to the spirit and truth of that. And not be awkward, I guess, but maybe I'm a little bit right.
I think two answers. One, I think how Juneteenth was started in Coos Bay is a good example, where it was started by the History Museum, who was predominantly white. But then they had the presence of mind to know that, well, once we created this foundation, we should hand it off to local members of the African American community. And so I think it's a combination of don't be afraid to get something started, or don't feel like you have to wait around until someone tells you that you should do this thing for justice, but also know, once I got this started, it's time for me to be able to hand it off. And so, you will, and so in terms of a lot of communities across Oregon, vastly, predominantly white, it does take white individuals to sometimes get a lot of these things going, because when you're such a numeric minority, you may not necessarily be comfortable starting something, perhaps. In Grants Pass, our predominant group is white, and based on last year, this year, and what we hope will happen next year, is with each year that goes by, local African Americans are feeling more comfortable to take a leading role in the planning. And so a lot of it is what you would try to do as white individuals, is to create foundations or what I've been calling footholds in a community for someone to climb up in. And can't change the racial demographics of your community overnight, but what you can do is just show out to these events, because even if you don't end up interacting, you have these Juneteenth events in many parts of Oregon and it's 95% white. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, because those members of the Black community who go to these events will see that perhaps there's more people in their community who care for the feelings of belonging than they had previously thought. And so I think that just showing up, making Coos Bay just known for Juneteenth is one way for African Americans in the community to feel like they have a sense of belonging, because they've been able to create something that is then shared by the wider community.
Thank you. It's very helpful. Come on, I know you got questions out there. Don't be shy. Think about it. Oh, we got one here.
I have more of a suggestion, building on what you said. People say, no.
The audience can't hear you if you don't.
People always say, what you said is mostly white here and so forth, but I'm finding that people don't see African Americans. I've had people tell me that there were no Black people here while somebody is walking past me in Walmart. I mean, I think it's important to recognize the people who are here. There are minority communities of several sorts, and it's time that we saw them.
I know you have a website, because I've looked at it before, on your, maybe you can tell us the URL to that again. Is there information about the Grants Pass project on that website, or do they have, is there a separate place for information? Because I have friends that live in that community that I'd like to let them know what's going on down there. And also, how did that get started? Was it also like from a museum or something like that? I'm curious.
Yeah, so OregonRemembrance.org, funny story, I misspelled the word remembrance the first time I bought the URL. And the corresponding email.
So
and
it was
that-
available.
Yeah. That will forever be my most expensive spelling error. Yeah. So OregonRemembrance.org, and that's, we've been a little bit busy. I need to create some updates, so you can find on Oregon Remembrance, there's information on the Sunrise Project. I need to update some of the things we've done since 2024 for Grants Pass, and then add a section for Ashland. But on the Grants Pass part, you'll be able to find this thing called Linktree. It's like a thing that's on social media where you have a single link, but then it holds a bunch of links. And so there's a bunch of information about our group, Grants Pass Remembrance, which got started. So how I got started doing the Alonzo Tucker work in Coos Bay is that I visited this museum in Montgomery called the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which was a national memorial to the thousands of African Americans who were lynched in this country. There are these 6-foot-high pillars that name the state, name the county, and the names of everyone who was lynched in that county. And living in Oregon my entire life, I couldn't believe that I had to go all the way to Montgomery, Alabama, just to learn there had been at least one widely documented lynching of an African American in Oregon. In conjunction with the museum, they had what was called the Community Remembrance Project, which aimed to do a series of acts of remembrance in communities where the lynchings took place. And there's an interest form about getting involved with the Community Remembrance Project. And first, I was too nervous to fill out the interest form. I was like, who am I to really think that I could be of any help? But then for the rest of my civil rights trip, I was really impacted by the stories of everyday people. And I realized that you don't have to be an extraordinary person to do extraordinary things. And so I filled out the interest form. And I remember telling my group, I was like, I don't know if anything will come for this, but I felt like I had to do it. And so that's how it got started in Coos Bay. But the organization that created the museum is called the Equal Justice Initiative. If you ever saw trailers for the movie Just Mercy with Michael B. Jordan, that was about a man named Brian Stevenson, who's the executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative and my personal hero. So if you haven't seen or read the book Just Mercy, I highly recommend it. But so Brian has done a lot of work around lynching and slavery in the United States, how this country can reckon and reconcile these histories. And someone from Grants Pass was just sort of similarly impacted by that work around lynching and slavery. So they just wrote, they were inspired to create a little booklet for their community about, it's called A Brief History of Racism in Oregon and Grants Pass. And they had just emailed the Equal Justice Initiative to say, oh, I was inspired by your work and we created a small little thing in our community just as a way to try to do something similar. And because I was working with the Equal Justice Initiative, they just connected us and were like, hey, we have this person who's doing something similar in Oregon, you should connect. And so we met over Zoom, and this was sometime in 2020, and it was like, you ever think about doing something similar in Grants Pass? And I was like, sure, like, I guess I'm doing sundown towns now. I was like, I just learned what these were. And so met with her a few times over 2020, and then I did the historical marker in Coos Bay, and after that, so the Oregon Remembrance Project and the work in Coos Bay was just this obscure personal side project, and I never really had any intention of doing more. But after connecting with the individual in Grants Pass, I decided that I would give the Oregon Remembrance Project 1 year. And if I could create anything in 1 year, I would keep going. If not, I would find a real job. And a year went by and it was going, and I was like, okay, I guess this is what I'm gonna do with the rest of my life. And so that's kind of how it got started, just this mutual connection, and it has grown ever since. One thing that I love to tell people is that I wish it was my idea to use the word sunrise for the Sunrise Project, because it's such a great idea. But that idea came from a 69-year-old white male truck driver from Grants Pass named Randolph. Which I think is really exciting, because it just sort of shows this is ordinary people trying to come together to try to do something extraordinary. So we would love to connect with your friends in Grants Pass and show them what we're doing.
For sure. Thank you.
Can we focus on Randolph for a little? No.
Hey, I'm from a minority, mostly community in California. And since I've been here, I've tried to talk to Black people about Juneteenth, and a lot of them just laugh at me or say, I don't celebrate that. Do you have a suggestion? Or what I could say to them, maybe if I see them in the future, to break that ice?
You know, I think, for, Black people aren't a monolith, and, like any large people group, and so, there's been differing opinions in the African American community going all the way back to whether we should end slavery. And so, there's always been different opinions. I will say the majority of Black people are on board and happy that Juneteenth is a federally recognized holiday. In terms of inviting people to Juneteenth, I think that in many communities, the invitation also has to come with a sense of you don't have anything to worry about. That in some of my experience, there is sometimes a resistance to putting on or expressing Blackness in largely white spaces, because the sort of putting on and expressing can at times feel like a target on your back. And so I think that part of making the invitation in predominantly white spaces is also helping them know what to expect, that they don't have to worry about potentially someone protesting at the event, that this is actually an established community tradition. And that would be the way I would go towards inviting Black members of the community to Juneteenth. That was some of my experience in Grants Pass, where it was like, do I really want, like, is it gonna be a bad thing if I go? And so I think that, telling folks about how Juneteenth got started in the community, that, there's this new title that you really want to keep going in the community, I think will hopefully maybe break some of that ice or initial resistance, for not just Black members in the community, but people at large. That would be my best suggestion.
Thank you.
First, thank you so much for all you've done for our community. I think all of our eyebrows, right? Rose, when you said that we were happy, like that was just like, this is Coos Bay, we made ourselves prepared for this. So thank you for pointing that out. This is the first I've heard about Timothy. Could you tell us a little bit more about his story and that?
Yeah, I will, there's flyers up there. He was an African-American sailor living in Coos Bay in 1924. Can't remember if he was married or engaged at the time. So if I'm remembering correctly, I believe there was some sort of confrontation at a bar He left. There is some mystery surrounding a local police officer who expressed negative sentiments about him. So I consider what happened to Timothy Pettis a racially motivated murder. And I withhold using the designation lynching, because I think that lynching, I characterize a lynching based on 3 criteria of whether it was, so in terms of brutality, spectacle, and impunity. And there is the brutality aspect, but it wasn't a spectacle because it was done in the middle of the night, and it wasn't done with impunity because even the Klan sympathizing governor at the time expressed a desire to find those who are responsible. So I categorized what happened to Timothy Pettis as a racially motivated murder. And, you know, it's unfortunate, there's still a lot of mystery, a lot we don't know about this 100-year-old cold case. And so I myself am a learner. There are other people who know more about this than I do. There will be someone who had done a presentation for the Oregon Black Pioneers a few years ago. They'll be at the event. We have some educational information. You'll actually learn a lot from the pamphlets. So just take the pamphlets to learn a little bit, whether you can join us or not. But I think that, you know, so I was here last month doing some filming for an OPB documentary, and as part of that, they wanted to go visit the sort of where we think the spot was on the bridge where Alonzo Tucker was hung. And that was my first time going back to that space since the very first time I visited Coos Bay. And for me, it was an interesting experience where even though it was the same physical space, I felt differently. You know, I would have described it 5 years ago as there was sort of an eerie silence at the sort of intersection right outside of the junior high at 7th and Golden. And it felt like there was an eerie silence. But coming back to that space recently, it felt more like there was peaceful silence because that story had been vocalized in as part of the geographic memory of the community. It's kind of interesting. So it's like a stop sign at 7th and Golden. And when I first came, I was like, that's kind of annoying. There's this big red stop sign at this like intersection. But going back, I was like, oh wait, in some ways that's like not just a traffic instruction, but it's like an instruction for reflection. I was like, okay, I do like the stop sign. And so I sort of had that moment in that space. And so I think that why I'm excited to be a part of the Timothy Pettis event is to help bring peace to the story. You know, it's lesser known, but there, you know, has been a silence, but we can sort of add this new chapter to his story so that as more and more people learn about him, they'll also learn about this thing that happened 100 years after this particular incident. And so I'm excited to be a part of something that also wasn't something I started, and that this was a community initiated event. And so that, you know, makes me happy. It's, you know, it's like your kid going off to college and growing up, and you're like, I'm so proud of you. So I'm excited. I hope many of you join us in July.
In your previous presentation that you gave virtually for us for Black History Month, we talked a lot about how, you know, slavery really didn't end after the Civil War. It just sort of evolved into Jim Crow era laws to mass incarceration and things like that. Would you mind speaking a little bit on that?
Yeah, you know, I don't think that forms of systemic oppression, well, okay, but not they can't, they have not so far. They have never really ended as much as they have evolved. And sort of that like core fundamental cause that created slavery once it ended, was evolved into convict leasing and Jim Crow segregation, which evolved into lynching, and in terms of this sort of state-sponsored control, you sort of see that in terms of mass incarceration, and it's always sort of been this pendulum in the United States where as we swung one way, we kind of swung back the other. So we had emancipation, we had Jim Crow, we had the civil rights movement, we had the war on drugs, we had George Floyd, we've had pushback to that. And so, I think that in terms of, it's not really like random why we have the problems that we have today. And that all these issues they're descendants of some greater legacy. What I think is important for us to think about is, kind of like, all right, slavery, lynching, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, a largely Southern, now it's a national issue, takes place mostly in the South. And so I think that for us here in Oregon, it is thinking about the evolution of Oregon's Black exclusionary laws. And so Oregon's Black exclusionary laws technically ended in 1926, but that's not when they really ended. They evolved into sundown towns, restrictive covenants, redlining, gentrification, displacement, and ongoing feelings of cultural expulsion that African Americans experience today. And so I think that our fundamental issue that we're grappling with in Oregon, similar to this legacy of oppression evolution, is just who is Oregon for? And the little phrase that I've been using recently is how we can do things that, quote, feed the needs of the spirit of being, belonging, and becoming for African Americans and other people of color in Oregon. And so so you're like, okay, we were founded with racially exclusionary laws. What do we do about it? Well, I'm gonna tell you. So my hope, and if spend enough time around me, you'll know I don't get caught up on questions like, how are you going to do that? And just push on. And so my big hope is I want to raise the African American population of Oregon from 2 to 5% by the year 2050. That may sound a little bit ambitious. That's less than 3 decades from now. But the population, the demographics of the United States are changing rapidly currently. It's expected that by the year 2044, people of color will make up greater than 50% of the US population. But the United States will not, quote, brown evenly. Certain parts of the country will become more diverse while others do not. And I think that if we don't do anything, there will be a second generation of white flight, where in the same way whites left the cities to move to the suburbs, whites will leave more diverse pockets of the state and move to the northwest and northeast. And Oregon was founded in 1859, and I don't want 200 years to go by and it's 2059 and people are moving to Oregon specifically for its whiteness. It would feel like we didn't accomplish or change anything in 200 years. And so that's a big problem. And you're like, okay, well, what do we do about it? I think it starts really at this local level where you create things that feel like cultural anchors and cultural magnets for people of color. Cultural anchors in like something that tethers you to a community, and magnet something that draws you in. Whenever I meet a new African American in the Portland area, I always ask them, what do you think? And without fail, 10 out of 10, 100% of the time, they always say some iteration of, it's an adjustment. They don't just mean it's an adjustment to the concentration of white people, but the concentration of whiteness. And so as the demographics of the United States are shifting, we will have to talk a little bit before about that identity reckoning. We will be having this reckoning about what it means to be an American. Because I don't think the white population on a whole is going to respond all the best to not being greater than 50% of the population, just based on how things have gone so far. And so I think that over these next 2 and 3 decades, as you had said, seeing the members of color in your community will help us redefine what it means to be an Oregonian. That an Oregonian isn't just a bearded white man in a flannel jacket who drinks IPAs. But a Oregonian really represents these diverse pockets of our community. And hopefully by representing that, by seeing these communities, by growing things like Juneteenth, we can hopefully have someone's initial response to moving into our communities not be it's an adjustment. And I think making changes at that local level is how we eventually affect that big issue over these next 2 or 3 decades.
So welcome back to Coos Bay. What do you think?
I think I can project. Can everyone hear me?
It's the stream.
Okay,
They've all.
got it.
So I'm assuming that there are like or similar organizations to yours in other states. So the question is 2 parts. Do you work with other organizations from other states? And I'm wondering if Oregon Remembrance also works with other groups, other cultural groups. Not for Juneteenth, obviously, but for other events.
Yeah. Interestingly, there's not that many other groups doing similar stuff across the United States. I work with groups from across the United States with some of the work that I do around the death penalty. But there isn't really there aren't state-specific organizations about reconciling state-specific histories of injustice, which is all the more reason why we get to be the leader and be like, yeah, Oregon. And so, I think there is both pressure and excitement that you don't have to reinvent the wheel because the wheel's never been invented yet. And so there's a little bit of relief because you're like, well, I can't be doing it wrong if no one else has done it right. But it is a little bit nerve-wracking because you're like, I don't know where to start. There's not really, so like the Equal Justice Initiative does stuff nationally, and there are groups who have plugged into that from across the United States. But to my knowledge, there's not like a Oregon Remembrance Project equivalent in other states. To your second question, I would love to be able to work with communities that and work with community histories that aren't just African American based. I like to say that Oregon has equal opportunity racism. It's for everyone. And so I currently don't work too much with other communities, not for lack of desire, but more so lack of bandwidth. So currently, the Oregon Remembrance Project is just me. I'm hoping to change that in the near future. And so I have been slow. And so it's almost a question you had asked earlier. It's also something I think of myself about, like, I myself don't represent these communities. And so I don't want to overstep in being like, well, I tackled like Native genocide, I got it. So I have been slow, but I hope that some of the work that I've done so far can be sort of that foundation or stepping stone for folks. So, especially when we are doing the Sunrise Project in Eastern Oregon. Eastern Oregon, there's a lot more sort of connection with the local tribes. And so I'm hoping that some of the things that we can do around sundown towns can be starting places for this work surrounding other groups in Oregon. Because, you know, I think the true actualization of a sunrise community encompasses the experiences of other marginalized and oppressed groups. And so sort of to answer your question based on what I told Forrest is I'm trying to do a lot of that foundation laying so that I can eventually find people to hand it off to be able to like take it and be representative of their own community. That process has just been slow due to my own restraints as a single individual. But that is something I would love to be able to do down the road.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. I appreciate your positive attitude and that you speak in a way that's non-confrontational, because I think in our community in particular, we need that more. I'm curious I want to share a story and then I want to ask you a question about interacting with you. I was at a meeting in the community today and an individual challenged the group that I was with to do more about mental health education. And he said, I learned about this from my granddaughter and she thought it was really important. And so I want to know why we're not doing more than that. And later on in this meeting, this individual he said, I want to lodge my protest and I'm really angry the banks are closed tomorrow because it's Juneteenth. And he said, I really hate these woke things that we're doing. And end of comment. And I thought, gosh, you know, if your granddaughter talked to you about who we are as a country and things she cares about, and if she cared about this issue, would his perspective change? And so my question to you is, can you get more involved in our schools with K-12 and just thank you for being non-confrontational about how you teach people and bring them along.
Yeah. I'm someone, so basically what I've just tried to do in all this is to try and do for others what was done for me. And part of that is I am a unique person in doing this work, and that I was not always this person. I grew up in a white evangelical environment, and I will always say I missed out on one of the most important days of my life in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected the first Black president of the United States, because had I been old enough, would have voted for John McCain and Sarah Palin. In 2012, I would have voted for Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan. I graduated high school with the dream of becoming a tough on crime prosecutor. Gave a speech my junior year of college in favor of capital punishment. And so part of which, you know, I think it's why I think that I'm doing the right thing, because I have a unique perspective of knowing that and believing that no matter where you go, you can find enough people who are willing to choose justice if given the opportunity. It's just a matter of getting them to see where there's been injustice. And so my little mantra for doing community organizing work is, rather than tell a community who they're not, tell them who they can be, and then show them the steps to becoming that community, allowing them to play an active role in their own journey. And I think that, you know, I'm, you know, when I was in sports, I preferred the coaches who were like more you wanted to do something for them, as opposed to the like antagonizing coach who would yell a lot. You're like, I'm gonna try and block you out. And I do think that that's sometimes a little bit similar to the sort of justice organizing. You're like, ooh, that loud person who's kind of being kind of abrasive, I'm just gonna tune you out. And so I think that the way we do this, so another one of my things that I hope is that even if someone doesn't agree with what I'm doing, my goal is that they at least respect how I'm doing it. And that helps soften their ability to come on this journey too. There's a saying in fundraising of, if you don't make the ask, you are saying no for them. And so I think that is true for this justice organizing work, where if you don't recognize their capacity to choose justice, you are denying them their humanity. And so in grants past, we talk about this idea that we are saving room at this table for everyone. Those who are ready and those who are not ready just yet. But part of saving room at that table, and there's like really complex strategies for how to do this work, and then there's also some really simple explanations of like, people generally follow the norms of reciprocity, and if you listen to them, they will most likely listen to you. If you say if you care about the things they care about, they're more likely to care about the things you care about. So that's kind of that's part of an answer. I hope that I don't really know how, like, standards from the Oregon Department of Education apply to educators across the state. But in 2026, they will have these I looked at them briefly, all these new social studies standards where kids in our K-12 will learn about things that none of us learned about when we were in school. And so I don't know whether that means they're not like dictates from the Oregon Department of Education, they're standards that refer people to things to teach. So I'm hopeful. I think that, and so it's like, well, if this individual's daughter cared about this, he'd be more likely to care about it too. I think that just shows how important relationships are, and specifically forming relationships with people who are different than you. There is often, I've noticed, so I come from Portland, and there is a false inclusivity that is often practiced, where it's often like, man, we have everybody at the table, except for the people we don't really have that much in common. And so in a lot of these spaces, I see a large absence of, in terms of when they talk about how inclusive a space is, a large absence of people from rural backgrounds, people from conservative backgrounds. And I don't think that you are truly actualizing your ideal if you are inclusive of the people who you like. That kind of defeats the purpose. And so I think that so much of this work is big and really intimidating. But one thing that I like to tell people is, don't let your inability to do everything stop you from doing one thing. And sometimes that one thing is building a relationship with one person. And that is, that's how a lot of the civil rights movement happened, especially in Mississippi, where it was a bunch of ordinary people doing their one thing. And eventually those little pieces of sand grew and grew and grew and created a mountain. And so, short answer, I don't really know. But I do think that building relationships, having that positive reinforcement is one way of being able to bring people along with you in this work.
Well, thank you very much, Taylor, for your time. So let's give a big hand to Taylor.
Oh, no, it's, so like, I wish our state legislators had to travel the state. Because it's like, just because you represent the 5th district of Portland, doesn't mean that you are not a part of this whole body of Oregon. And I like coming to, I've come here quite a bit over these last few years, and, I like got here today without having to use Google Maps. And so, it's that, you create, I feel a part of the Coos Bay, Grants Pass, and Ashland, the other part of the community. And my hope is to be able to, so probably next year, we're gonna start, well, hopefully, start these things that have tentatively called sunshine trips, where we will be, facilitating groups, specifically African Americans from the Portland or urban centers, to visit some of these different parks in Southern Oregon, where it's one thing to sort of hypothetically being told that you're welcome there. It's another thing to feel like you've been specifically invited. And so wanting to have African Americans come to Coos Bay to see some of the history related things, go to Grants Pass, to see some of the nature things, go to Ashland to see some of the theater things. We're just sort of facilitating more of this connection between parts of the state. I hope will make us a healthier body. Long way to say, this is an adjustment that I'm happy with, and I'm happy being here. And so thank you all for having me.
So we have a lot more updates, so to save one for the road, we have some free Juneteenth memorabilia in the table right in front. We have some wristbands, some pins, please take something. And then tonight, anyone joining us on live stream in Curry County, we have the Redwood Theater, free showing of Black Panther this evening at 6 p.m. And then tomorrow, the Black Market Gourmet here in Coos Bay, we will have the Juneteenth celebration for the city, so please join us. And then Thursday again at 11 o'clock, Performing Arts Center, a lot going on, folks. All right. Stay awesome. Bye.